Welcome everyone to this webinar, which is organised by the Centre for Autism and Theology. My name is Henna Kundal, and I'm one of the researchers working with the Centre. I will introduce today's speaker in a moment, but for those who haven't joined us before, the Centre for Autism and Theology was launched in 2018 and is co-directed by Professor Grant McCaskill and Dr. Leon van Ommen. The Centre aims to host interdisciplinary research into autism in relation to theology, church and faith. So the Centre acts as something of a hub that brings together all those interested in how autism and theology intersect. The aim is to contribute to the academic discourse, but also to be of service to the church and to other faith communities. If you want to find out more about the Centre, do take a look at the Centre for Autism and Theology website, where you can also sign up to our mailing list and find out how to get involved with what the Centre is doing. You can also follow us on social media. But today it is my pleasure to introduce our speaker, Harry Gibbins. Harry is a doctoral research student with the Centre for Autism and Theology. His doctoral work is looking at the intersection between autism and Christian ministry, but today he's going to be speaking to us about how the game Dungeons and Dragons helped him as he began to understand his diagnosis of autism. Harry lives in Aberdeenshire with his young family, and he's published in the journal Theology in Scotland, also discussing Dungeons and Dragons. And as well as his current research project, his research interests include the works of Dietrich Bonhoeffer. Harry will talk to us for about 35 minutes, and after that, we'll have a 2-minute break. During that break and after, you can type your questions into the chat box, and we'll have a time of Q&A, and I'll give some more instructions about how to do that after Harry's talk. So Harry, thank you for joining us today, and we look forward to hearing what you have to say.
Hello, it's very exciting to be chatting to you guys today. Thank you, Henna, for that wonderful introduction. I'm just going to share my PowerPoint with you guys. Hopefully we can all see that. I'm sure someone will let me know if something's wrong. Okay, so yes, my name's Harry Gibbins, and I'm a doctoral student here at Aberdeen. Today, I'm going to be going through why I think Dungeons and Dragons is great, basically. It's a game that's been very close to my heart for a number of years now, and it's been very helpful as I've kind of therapeutically gone through a fairly challenging stage in my life. So let's start with just a quick overview of my presentation today. So step 1, I'm going to teach you how to fight a dragon. Obviously, I'm being slightly facetious. What I mean is I'm going to go over what Dungeons and Dragons is. I want to try and make this as accessible as possible to as many people as we can. And I completely understand that Dungeons and Dragons has potentially a slight reputation for being incredibly nerdy, with lots of details and rules, etc., etc. So I'm going to try and give a good overview of not only what the game is, but kind of how it's played, why I feel like it's important. Second, also within this kind of theme of trying to make this as accessible as possible, I really want to try and make the theology that I'm going to talk about as easy to understand. I want to avoid making this some sort of academic ivory tower where we use lots of Latin words that no one really knows what they mean. So I'll go over what's called the concept of the image of God. That became a big theme as I was a master's student writing my dissertation, and that kind of inspired a lot of this work, the work I was doing as a master's student as I played Dungeons and Dragons, and the game kind of helped me understand a bit more about the image of God. So we'll go over that. Thirdly, I want to go over my own lived experience of what it was like being diagnosed as autistic. Especially in how that impacted my understanding of my Christian faith, and what it meant to need a supportive community around me, of which Dungeons and Dragons was a big part of. Lastly, I want to demonstrate how Dungeons and Dragons has helped facilitate a lot of personal growth and introspection within me, as I became more comfortable with this idea that I had a diagnosis of autism. And in this last section, I will introduce you all in what will probably be the most bizarre PowerPoint slide you've ever seen in a theology seminar, to the character that I played as part of the Dungeons and Dragons game I play with my friends. So here is the article that this presentation is based on. So when I came to the end of my master's degree, I'd written a dissertation that was on Christian ethics and disability, and the image of God. And as part of that dissertation, I had slightly flippantly mentioned that, or maybe one approach to talking about disability and Christian ethics is to engage in new and creative methods of dialogue. And I suggested, hey, look, here's this really cool game that I play called Dungeons and Dragons that basically facilitates a new creative method of dialogue. And I kind of brushed over it very lightly, perhaps slightly nervous that I was talking about Dungeons and Dragons in my master's dissertation for a degree. However, when I came to the end, I saw that Theology in Scotland had a call for papers out. They were doing an issue on autism and theology, and they were looking for people to contribute. And I thought, why not give it a go? I'll see if they would be interested in me endlessly rabbiting on about Dungeons and Dragons, and they were. So I wrote an article for them that was called Rolling with Advantage. If you search Rolling with Advantage Theology in Scotland on Google, I'm sure it comes up. A lot of what I'm going to talk about today is gone over in more detail there. If you're interested in the kind of theological nitty-gritty details, then you can find it all there. There's loads more italicized Latin in there for those who enjoy that kind of thing. Something that I had noticed in doing this study was that this idea of the image of God, or Imago Dei, if you want to be a nerd, is that there was a degree of flexibility in that how it was interpreted, and sometimes that meant that people with disabilities, people who were outside of the bubble of normal, were at risk of being excluded from communities, and I obviously wanted to avoid that. So, what is Dungeons and Dragons? As I've said, I've tried to make this as approachable as possible, and so I'm going to start with just a brief introduction to the game so we all understand the basics. It's worth saying that with this in mind, Dungeons and Dragons is a very complicated game. It's called a tabletop role-playing game, which effectively, unsurprisingly, means that you play it as a group, usually at a table, but a lot of people, including myself, now play it online. The pandemic has kind of grown that scene incredibly quickly. And you play characters. So in the top right of this slide, you can see what a typical classic Dungeons and Dragons table might look like. And yes, that is a hedgehog on that clipboard. I don't know why it was there. I just found this image on Pinterest and thought it looked funny. The game is facilitated by a leader player called a dungeon master or game master. I'll abbreviate that down to just DM to make this a bit easier. The DM's role is to set the stage, as it were. So they plan encounters and towns, conflicts, other characters that the players can interact with. They might construct a broader overarching narrative that the rest of the players embed themselves in. It's a very complicated role, one that I have not participated in before. And it's usually taken by someone who is most familiar with the rules, usually by someone who has a lot of experience playing the game. The other players, or player characters, create a backstory or an origin for the character they want to play. They consider their motivations, interest, goals, how they might respond to conflict that's been placed in front of them by the DM. In this sense, Dungeons and Dragons takes on a form that's actually quite similar to an improv acting group, where there are certain rules in place for for how your character acts, and then you're placed in a scenario and asked to respond. This does sound like a lot to juggle, and sometimes it definitely is, especially for new players. But this is all guided by a selection of rule books. You can see those in the bottom right. A lot of the very basic rules are available for free on the Dungeons and Dragons website. But for players who wish to see in vast detail, you can get many books. Here's one here. This is the Player's Handbook. So this is the one that a lot of the player characters would look to for guides on how to build characters, play the game, that kind of thing. It is worth saying that one of the most interesting parts, I think, of Dungeons and Dragons in its current form, there's been lots of different variations on it, is that there's a general culture that the rules are more like guidelines, and so ultimately it's up to the DM how hard to enforce the rules. So something that the group I play with incorporate is the rule of cool, where if the player wants to bend the rules slightly for the sake of doing something really cool, then the DM might show a degree of leniency. A lot of the doing in Dungeons and Dragons comes in the form of rolling a dice. So here I can't see myself, so I have no idea if this is going to come up very well. This is a D20. It's a 20-sided die, and the vast majority of the things that you will do in the game will be responded to with you must roll a d20 to see how successful you are. So a dungeon master might place a group of adventurers in a town and ask, what do you want to do? And then it's up to the players to think creatively. Will the goals of their character influence their decision, or will the greater good of the group take over? A player might respond by saying, do I see anything suspicious? And so the DM will ask the player to roll the 20-sided die to see how successful they are at investigating their surroundings. Certain abilities that players choose might make their character better at certain skills, but this is the core mechanic of the game that allows for a level of unpredictability towards a key goal that continues to be always at the centre, which is telling a good story. And that's what I'm going to come back to frequently here. It might not always go your way. So perhaps you roll a 1, the lowest possible score. And so you get immediately spotted by the enemy. But then the story you tell as a group will always be more interesting. The enemy who spotted you locks you away in a dungeon, and now you have a new goal: escape. This ever-evolving nature of D&D is what allows it to, theoretically, go on for as long as the players are having fun. In this sense, there's no winning to D&D, just telling an exciting, fun, and adventurous story. I think this has been recently illustrated really well in the Netflix series Stranger Things, which we can see in the bottom left there, where the kind of core group of characters play a game of Dungeons and Dragons, and that kind of mirrors what's happening throughout the show. So I propose that this idea of telling a good story is illustrated through this image. And of course, because I'm a theologian, I couldn't help myself but suggest a trinity to help illustrate this. So here we have 3 elements that kind of merge together to form Dungeons and Dragons. The most simple, I think, is the gameplay. So that's in the bottom right there. There are rules in place to make sure the game is fair. Everyone gets their chance to shine. There are puzzles and challenges that await to test the player's skills and knowledge. Next, I want to draw attention to collaboration. So that's in the bottom left. Dungeons and Dragons is a collaborative game, even if the players cannot always agree on an action or how to respond to something. Such conflict still engages in a level of collaboration in the sense that the game's still being played together. The third area at the top there, and I think this is most key, is storytelling. Dungeons and Dragons is narratively driven, or at least the current edition of the game is. In its most early forms, Dungeons and Dragons was much more railroaded. And what I mean by that is you were given a very set number of options for what you could do. So the DM might say, You are in a dungeon, ahead of you is 2 doors, and now it's up to you to decide as a group, do you choose the door on the left or the door on the right? Very simple example, but I think it illustrates it. Characters were more archetypal back then, and backstory was just used as set dressing, rather than something that influences your decision making. In 5th edition, which is the current edition of the game, although I'm aware it's just next year will be succeeded by the next one. This idea of telling a good story became a more central goal, and it's part of the reason that the game has kind of exploded in popularity in the last 10 years. So a good example of this might be allowing your character's backstory to influence decision making in a way that you, the player, knows might not be the most logical. Perhaps your character is hot-tempered and might throw a table across the room at the first sign of conflict, to the dismay of the other characters. This is what we commonly refer to as roleplay. I'll come back to this idea a lot. In fact, I have a really good example of that here. So this is Brennan Lee Mulligan. He's an American comedian and writer, but he's perhaps most well known for hosting a D&D web series called Dimension 20, where he plays a game of D&D with his friends. It's a really interesting watch, although it is not representative of the general D&D experience, because the budget they have is absolutely insane, and they have people whose jobs it is to create props and miniature sets for the players to interact with, and that is simply not the case for most people. It is interesting though. Something that I think Brennan here is really good at is the way he approaches how he creates a character. So let's say there's just this very short clips, about 10 seconds. Zoe, let me know if you can't hear it.
I play this like socialist paladin who's like an ex-thief.
Oh my gosh.
And he was like a member of a thieves guild, got clocked in the head in a robbery gone wrong, almost died and was revivified by priests, and decided to turn his life around and become a paladin. But his whole deal is he's Oath of Redemption, and is like, whenever he fights bad guys, he before combat starts, is like, listen, I've been where you've been. I know what you're going through. You don't have to do this, all right? We don't got to do this right now. And it's like yeah, he's a real paisan. He's a very Benvolio. Yeah, so it's like, but in each of those things, like the empathy is the point of like, I want to try to be somebody I want to occupy a different perspective. I play this like socialist
we're getting it again.
Who's like an ex.
There we go. So I want to occupy a different perspective. That like blew my mind when I heard him say it. I brought this clip up to the group I played D&D with recently, and it led to a really interesting discussion. So in every decision that you make as a character, you're effectively being asked, who do I want to be right now? Perhaps this is really simple, and you want to just imprint a version of yourself onto your character. So as an example, the first character I ever played with the same group, effectively, that I play with now, except we all lived far more locally than we do now. I've moved to Scotland. The very first character I played was an elf called Theron, and he was a knight who valued protecting the vulnerable. At the time, I was a youth worker. And so the influences become quite clear. Theron was a good, although perhaps surface level, reflection of my professional self. So Theron, in a way, was also a youth worker. This idea becomes a bit more interesting, but I argue a bit more challenging when we ask how a character might reflect parts of ourselves that we're less comfortable with. More so if you come to this from the opposite angle, which I think Brennan is doing when he's talking about his socialist paladin, in trying to occupy a different perspective. What happens when you try and play a character whose experience is vastly different from your own? In other words, can D&D become a therapeutic exercise? This led me to an interesting conundrum. So I'm sure many of us have seen this image before. This is Michelangelo's The Creation of Adam. It's a very famous painting, and is often used to represent, whether this was Michelangelo's intention or not, to represent the theological concept of the image of God. In other words, this is the idea that human beings have been created in God's image, and that identifies them as different to the rest of creation. This is a somewhat contentious topic, and I do not claim to have a perfect answer, as we will see. This is especially contentious when we take it from the angle of disability. If people are made in the image of God, how do we start to conceive of this if some people take a form that's not expected? Do they still embody this image, or do they have a broken or lesser image? Sometimes the image of God idea is used to argue that this is why human beings are rational and intelligent beings. And Michelangelo perhaps thought this as well. Someone pointed out to me a while ago that in this image, God is sitting in effectively a brain, like the throne he's on, the outline of it kind of makes the shape of like a cross section of a brain. Yet this becomes challenged, the idea of intelligence and rationality being bestowed upon human beings through the image of God, when we start to consider things like learning disability. There is an obvious risk that by focusing too much on this sort of image of God and this sort of theology, that a theology emerges that starts to segregate human beings into those who are rational and intelligent image bearers and those who aren't. There's some interesting other interpretations that I found on my travels around the internet. So this is called The Rebuke of Adam and Eve by Domincello. I thought this was really interesting. Also taking a clear influence from Michelangelo's work. You see that same sort of outline around God. He's coming down from the sky, bestowing something on Adam. Here there's an even more patriarchal focus, and it incorporates the fall narrative as well. Here God's rebuking Adam, who in turn blames Eve, who then points at the serpent. There's still some problematic things here, and I'm not an art historian, so I can't give huge details on the ins and outs of this. But I just thought, on one sense, that this is quite funny, because both Adam and Eve kind of look like they're saying, "Can you believe this guy?" as they're pointing at the person to the left. Lastly, slightly more seriously, this one. Here's another interpretation I came across. This is called The Creation of God by a woman called Harmonia Roselles, taking a black feminist approach to her illustration. Part of this, and I'm aware that this was probably not Roselles' intention, but it did reveal to me how I already held my own bias, in that I didn't notice how overwhelmingly white all of the pictures and images and paintings, even on just a simple image search on Google, show up. So this image is also taking the question of divine motherhood into consideration, rather than singularly conceiving as God as a father. Like I said, I'm not an art historian, and there's probably far more nuanced explanations about the ins and outs of the different choices that the artists are making. But the point I'm trying to make for the purposes of this presentation is that this theological concept has a degree of flexibility in how we can start to imagine what that means. It becomes problematic when, like in the example of the divine image being contributing to rationality or intelligence, it becomes problematic when we believe we have a concrete, immovable form, that we know what exactly the image of God is and what it looks like. This became particularly interesting, as I said, when I was a master's student, as I was kind of coming to terms with my approach to my autism diagnosis. What would my painting look like if I was to take on this challenge? I am not a painter, and I could never do anything as complex and as amazing as these pieces of work. But if I could, how would it look? Is autism compatible with this sort of theology? So I was diagnosed as autistic as an adult, but I had been, for a lack of a better term, and I'm aware the weight behind these words, I was flagged up when I was in primary school. So this largely surrounded how I socialized. For example, for a little while, I refused to talk to anyone other than my mum for the first couple of years of school. And I can only imagine how frustrating that was for my teachers, who were desperately trying to get me to participate in lessons. I even remember being like 14 and being in a parents' meeting and my English teacher saying, "Yeah, Harry produces good work, but he just never says anything. He never gets involved in the lessons." I'm thinking, this has always been the case, and I'll try really hard to do better, but it would last a couple of weeks. I also had a tendency to catastrophize. So I remember being 7 years old and crying all night to the dismay of my mother because I didn't get a piece of work done at school. And I was worried that to the level that I wasn't going to sleep at all, that I wouldn't manage to get it done the following day. Words got bounced around, things like generalized anxiety disorder, mental health issues, before landing on autism by the time I was a university student. It's still not a perfect definition, and as many of the people, I'm sure people who are watching and people who are part of the centre know, autism can mean so many different things. But at this point, it just makes sense to me. This continued to challenge me, especially in terms of socializing. When I started to kind of bring this together with my faith. So in the top right there, that's Udney Green Church in Aberdeenshire. It's actually the church where I got married, looking very beautiful in the snow. When I started to think about what this meant in terms of my Christian faith, I landed on this question of, why was it that God made me like this? Couldn't have God just made me more confident? Surely that would make me a better youth worker or parent or academic, etc., etc. Why couldn't he just let it all go away? This was most potently felt when I was about 15, and I started to display these tics, so involuntary movements and sounds, that at the time was put down to exam stress. And they still continue today. And more recently, I've kind of begun to question whether this is something, the tics, that I need to hide, after spending about 10 years learning strategies to make sure people didn't see them. This reflection is a constantly evolving process, and I will never have a perfect answer that encompasses all of not only my specific experiences, but the experiences of other people, autistic or not. Like the different interpretations we saw of the image of God with the paintings, autism is something that I'm constantly having to come to terms with. It is purposefully unsettled. This is a double-edged sword, however, as receiving my diagnosis didn't just give me all the answers. Where does being autistic fit in with the rest of Harry? Is that a stupid question? Should I be thinking so categorically about these different aspects of me, or should I just accept that I'm autistic through and through and leave it? Again, this is an ongoing process. But inspired by a friend of mine, I'll tell you more about that in a second, I decided that I would try and experiment with these ideas, the questions that I was left with, through the medium of D&D. After all, a lot of the issues I had surrounding socializing and community pressure seemed to evaporate within the context of the game. Could I now address these deeply personal themes, as I shall now explore? So this is when I said this is the weirdest PowerPoint slide that you'll ever see in a theology seminar. This is the one I was talking about. So this is Nine, or to call him by his full name, Captain Nine, Baron of Meadway. I think I've spelt Baron wrong. He'd be very disappointed in that. So this character is a character that I played for roughly 3 years within the context of an online Dungeons and Dragons game that started during the pandemic. And 9 was very much inspired by a character that a friend of mine played, who I know is listening at the moment. Hello, you know who you are. He played a character called Tarak, who was a big hulking Goliath, so like a giant. And this friend of mine used the character to work through how he approached anger. He felt like he had been taught that anger was something to constantly be avoided and that he wasn't allowed to be angry. He must be a calm person all the time. And Dungeons and Dragons, potentially like without meaning to, it just naturally evolved this way, allowed him to play with the why behind why he felt this way. So I took that idea and I thought, well, let's try and do a similar thing. So I'm gonna just read the description that I gave 9 in the article that I pointed to at the start. You can hear much more about him there. So this is 9, Captain 9, Baron of Meadway. Get ready for a very weird sentence. He is a level 13 Tabaxi Paladin. 9 is not real, obviously. He is a creation of my imagination and is deeply inspired by my love for Doctor Who. He is no more real than the characters in Jesus's parables, and yet his realness, 9 as an embodied reality, comes into being when I sit down to play the game. So this is not to speak of some sort of mysticism or to overly spiritualize what continues to remain in my imagination. 9 is not real, but he does exist as part of my reality. This is because I wrote 9 very intentionally as an outward reflection of my inward self. So 9, in this sense, is autistic, even if the game world doesn't have that kind of language. His interactions with other members of the team are socially awkward. He becomes hyper-fixated on details often missed by others, and he has an overall dispassion for gossip. This, again, is not to say that 9 represents all autistic people, but simply to say that 9 and myself are somewhat the same, and therefore it's not facetious to say that his interactions are autistic in the sense that they are also autistically me. Dungeons and Dragons became a platform for me to, at my own pace, start to encounter some of the deeply rooted insecurities that I had held onto from my school years. This relied on several things. 1, I had and continue to have a super supportive group of friends who I play D&D with. 2, I was in a position where I felt ready to address the questions that 9 would inevitably raise. And 3, I simply put, had a decent understanding of the game by this point. This allowed me to journey with 9 and ask, and I'm aware how cliche this sounds coming from a Christian, what would 9 do? As I played the game, I embodied 9. The line being drawn between the two of us was intentionally fuzzy. What this emerged as, through the improvised, natural storytelling nature of the game, that I've already discussed is so central, is that 9 found authentic and genuine friendships with the other members of the group. There was one interaction between other players, who I also know are listening, in which one asked the other, "What's up with 9?" And the second character simply replied, "9's just 9." And somehow, in this incredibly brief interaction, in 3 words, where 2 of the words are the same word, something bled through into the real world. And for a second, Harry felt seen by the player through the interaction of the fictional characters. Harry is just Harry. 9 is just 9. I just am. There's no image like the paintings that will fully be able to illustrate the complexity of human experience. And yet through this interaction, I am being taught in a way that makes sense to me, more about who I am. Now, this is obviously not perfect. For example, have I just replaced the need to find an explanation with the image of God with a game? Maybe. Similarly, have I been incredibly lucky to find a group of friends who not only want to support me and love me for who I am, but who want to tell their own stories as well? Yes, I have been insanely lucky. Another player used the same setting to tell his story of depression, and this was potent, challenging, at times uncomfortable, but I felt like I was drawn closer into understanding who he is and the path that he has walked, again through acting, essentially stuff that wasn't real in the conventional sense. I believe that this is the opportunity that Dungeons and Dragons opens up that is absent from other forms of storytelling and gaming. So if we think about your more traditional video game type setting, you're given a very strict number of things you can do. So a good comparison to make is like there's a very popular video game series called The Elder Scrolls, which is kind of always drawn comparisons with D&D because of the fantasy setting. They're quite similar. But regardless of what you want to do in the game, you are always the chosen one. You can't just choose not to be. And yet in D&D, you are a person and you can choose to just do what you want. And that allows for this kind of playground effect where you can start to toy with ideas that you might not be comfortable with in the real world approaching, like these very heavy themes of mental health. So yeah, I will leave us there. I want to say a very big thank you to the Centre for Autism Theology for letting me go on and on about something that I care a lot about. And I also want to take this opportunity to thank the 5 other guys who every second Thursday adventure with me through the mysteries of Usunar. I don't think I can really articulate excuse me, how big of a deal playing the game has been for me as I went through a global pandemic, becoming a dad, and then deciding to go back to university and do a PhD. D&D has cemented itself as such a great opportunity for me to be honest about how I'm doing in a way that sometimes I struggle to articulate in more conventional methods of therapy. But yeah, Henna, over to you. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Harry. That was just brilliant. That was fascinating. And I'm sure there's going to be a lot of discussion in the chat. But first, we're going to have a short break just for 2 minutes to give everybody a chance to process and have a think. And then we'll move into our Q&A time. So we'll see you again shortly. Welcome back, everyone. So it's time to have a look at our questions and see what's coming in that people would like to ask Harry. And I can see we have one already. So a questioner asks, thank you so much. Have you tried any RPGs? Role-playing games. Hey, got it right. Have you tried any role-playing games that are not D&D? I found trying out other games such as Tales from the Loop, Wander Home, Avatar Legends, ... that they enable so much more of the story and emotional development that you are talking about than D&D ever could. What do you think, Harry?
Yeah, so this reminds me of when I was playing as not online, when we were in real life, back when we lived in Watford. We tried playing a homebrewed version of the game where the guy who was DMing what he wanted to play in like a zombie apocalypse setting, and that meant there needed to be like some tweaking to the rules to kind of make it make sense. And what we found was, because there was no kind of fantasy level, there was no magic or elves or dwarves or whatever, you know, that kind of stuff. The focus became more on the like interactions with the world. So a lot of the problems we encountered were way more practical. And it was really interesting because what that effectively led to was a complete conflict between what the party wanted to do. And it led to the campaign ending because one of the players had just like had enough and decided to pull the pin on the grenade and just lob it into the room and basically sacrifice himself to end it all, that kind of thing. That's the closest I've got to playing like other. I'm aware that there's others like Pathfinder and stuff that kind of try to address some of the criticisms of D&D to try and get through a lot of the kind of very bogged down detail and just get to the role play. I can't speak to specifics, mainly because I think, and this is part of the problem I think with D&D, is because it's got such a monopoly on this is the one, this is the big one, this is the popular one, this is the one that is in Stranger Things and the Big Bang Theory and that kind of thing. It's the default and everything gets compared to it. And because we are so invested in this particular like set of rules, maybe it's slightly daunting to try and go for something that's different. I think part of the strength of something like this, and I think is drawn out from having such a supportive group of friends to play with, is that there is that degree of flexibility with what the rules are. And actually, even though I'm aware that there might be better games that try to facilitate this level of playing characters, because we're all kind of in it together and we all are on the same page in terms of how we want to tell stories, even if the stories ends up being very tonally different, that's what really allows for that to shine through. It's less about what does the rule book say and more, well, what do we want to do? How do you want to do this? It's like the classic D&D phrase, and I think that's just what enables that level of introspection. I hope that answers your question.
Great, thank you. So our next question then is, have you ever experienced anxiety around playing D&D? I've played for many years and love it, but have found over recent years that it is also sometimes a source of some considerable anxiety.
Yes. So when I first started playing the game, and again, this is slightly different because it was in person and we've moved to doing it online. I did feel there was a level of anxiety around needing to know all the rules. And that was like the focus for me for a while when we first started playing the game. I was lucky in the sense that the way my group came about was that a friend of a friend was moving to the area and he was really into D&D and he wanted to run a game for us. And he was so invested in it. It was like, this was his thing, was Dungeons and Dragons. He knew everything about it. Whilst the other three people, so myself and two friends, we'd never played it, or we'd like tangentially known something slightly about it. And so the DM was able to kind of, knowing that was the case, knowing that there would be a level of anxiety, potentially influenced by the fact that he was also a youth worker, and so kind of bring that into conversation with it. He built the game in a way that was meant to be really accessible for just knowing what the basics are to start with. So something he did and this became like a consistent recurring character who kept cropping up, was he effectively also played a character. So he played like a wizard, a wise old man, a proper Gandalf type called Tolliver. And Tolliver effectively became like our guide to for the start of it. So our first mission was to go and rescue Tolliver. He's been kidnapped by goblins. We've got to go rescue Tolliver. And the DM was able to kind of, because he had a voice as a character in the game, he could kind of help us out and steer us in a way that we needed to kind of alleviate that anxiety. As you saw earlier, these rule books are quite thick and very wordy. Very wordy. Oh, you can't see that, but you get the idea. And you can go on and on and on and on and on into the details. I think part of the way the anxiety for me has been lifted absolutely comes from that level of knowingness from my other party members that it doesn't necessarily need to be about keeping to the rules. I think sometimes that when there's been difficulties in other games, it's because players, everyone has like a different style of how they want to play the game, and some people are really into getting the biggest number that they can hit the enemy with. They've got a great big sword, and when they hit the enemy with a sword, there's a great big number, and that fulfills them, that they've managed to work out a way of doing a big number. That doesn't really interest me, and so I really want to just I think a friend of mine called it the Netflix player. So I really like just sitting back and being like, this is just really cool what's going on. I just love learning about all the things that are happening as if I'm watching my own personal Netflix show. Sometimes when I've not been able to make the games that we now play online, we record them. We use like Discord to meet, and we record the sessions, and then I listen to it back, and it's kind of like having my own personal podcast. It's just for me. No one else gets this. This is just for me, just my story that I get to share with these other guys as well. Not everyone wants that. And I think if there is that conflict of like conflicting interests, that can definitely lead to higher anxiety. I still occasionally, when it pops up on my calendar, oh, you're playing D&D tonight, remember, it's that second Thursday, so at 7:30 make sure the kids are in bed because you're playing D&D. There still is like a little bit of like a butterflies in my stomach where I don't really know why, but I do feel a bit anxious, and I think that does come from the fact that D&D is still a social game. Like, it still relies on you interacting with others. I wonder if, because there is this level, the borders between myself and my character are intentionally fuzzy. Perhaps I can be more confident, or can allow myself to experiment with the person I want to be. So at the moment, I am playing a character who is a bit more brash and a bit more prickly, which isn't really like me at all in the real world. And it's kind of fun to be like, what is it like to be that kind of person? What is it like to occupy that different perspective? I think that's where the anxiety is alleviated. I think it's when I really embed myself in that. So thanks for your question. Hope that answers it.
Brilliant. Thank you, Harry. We have someone else asking, have you ever tried the Bible version of D&D? You mentioned that your youth worker was this Gandalf character, Gandalf type character. Did he ever visit upon you the Bible version of D&D? Have you ever used it? Is it a tool for mission, or is it worth getting and using as a tool for mission?
That sounds absolutely fascinating, and I'm afraid to say I did not know that there was a Bible version of the game. What I will say, in the context of youth work, so when myself and my line manager at the time, now very close friend who I continue to play D&D with, we were both going to leave those jobs at the same time. So I was going to move to a new job. He was going to go and train to be ordained in the Church of England. And so it led to actually quite a nice convenient moment where we could properly say goodbye to the young people. Like, this is not because we necessarily want to leave you guys, but this time's coming to an end, so let's make sure we do this properly. And one of the things that the young people wanted to do, specifically the kind of core group who had been around for many years at this point, who knew myself and the other youth worker very well, and who did the more faith-focused kind of youth alpha, Bible studies, that kind of stuff, those guys, they were really keen to try and play D&D. So this was led by this other friend of mine. He's got the more experience, far more experience, running these games than I do. He kind of led them through a slightly stripped back version of D&D. They were still allowed to like create their characters, write backstories, come up with it themselves, but he was still kind of overseeing, making sure that they understood and kind of peeled back some of the complexity that wasn't really necessary for them. And then he plonked them into a game world or a storyline that he had used before, so he knew the general procedure that was gonna lay out. And while it was a bit more railroady, I used that word earlier, in that there was more of a strict point A, point B, point C to the narrative, how they encountered that was still completely up to them. And so sometimes groups would miss entire things, would happen completely in their absence because they decided not to go into the hut and see what was in there. And other times they kind of approach conflict in a way that completely dismisses the issue. And then other times they're in like a battle that lasts half an hour. Something that was really interesting that we did not anticipate at all comes from this theory that I think has a lot marries quite well with what I've been saying today, is that when you create a character in D&D, there's usually, intentionally or not, a level of yourself that you always end up implanting into your character. And that's very useful from a therapeutic standpoint, because like I use that very intentionally to be like, what happens when I play an autistic character? For the young people, even though we hadn't told them that, we hadn't said, make a character there's actually a therapeutic exercise, please, because this is still youth group and we've got to do some deep and meaningful stuff. All of them still created characters that somehow reflected what we knew they were going through at home. So there was a young person who created a dwarf ranger, which for those who aren't familiar is a bit of a strange combination. It's still possible within the rules, but the idea is that was an unusual pairing. Dwarfs are usually take the stronger roles in the party, and rangers are very quick and nimble and scamper up trees and fire arrows from above, that kind of thing. And the reason why this young person did that is because she had had a conversation with her parents about how she wanted to go to university, and she was told, people like us don't do that. We're working class folk, you can't go to university. So she, again, we did not tell her to do that. She used that to influence how she approached playing the character in the game. And maybe it was an influence, I don't know. She did eventually go to university, which I think is really incredible, that she kind of decided to choose for herself what she wanted to do, and she had agency in that moment. Maybe D&D helped with that, I don't know. But I think that is where, as a youth worker, D&D is a really interesting tool to approach those kinds of relationships and those kinds of discussions that young people tend to want to have but maybe don't know how to. There's a lot of work on how D&D is particularly useful for young people who find conventional therapy quite difficult. So, and I find it very unapproachable to be sat opposite a therapist to be asked, so how does that make you feel? And I say, good or bad. and I don't really know where to take it from there. And it has to be really teased out. And yet D&D is so much easier. And maybe it's because there is that level of I'm almost being protected by my character. It's not me, but it is me. But if it all kind of goes wrong, there isn't a consequence. In the real world, it doesn't matter. I hope that answers your question. Thanks. It was a really interesting question.
Great. Time to rush out and buy the Bible D&D version. see what it's about. Next question is very broad. I wonder if I can narrow it down a bit. So it asks, can you say more of the relationship to D&D to the Imago Dei, to the image of God that you were talking about? I guess if we want to just narrow that down, I'm sure that there was more from the paper that you didn't include because you didn't want to go over your 35 minutes. So perhaps you can give us a window on that, or whatever else you'd like to talk about.
Yes. So, like I said, the article does go into way more detail, and so feel free to look that up. Again, Rolling with Advantage, Theology in Scotland, I'm sure it appears. There can't be that many articles called that. Something that I drew on in the article was there were these three repeating concepts. When you look into the literature around this, there's these three concepts of the Imago Dei. And one of the more popular from a disability theology perspective is the relational Imago Dei. So that one says that it's not necessarily that in the image of God we're bestowed intelligence or rationality, but actually it's our ability to form relationships with one another. It's the fact that human beings are fundamentally social beings, which is easier to digest, I think, because it becomes less about people's abilities academically or intellectually, and more about something that we just kind of assume all of us do, and that's make friends. The problem, and it's again with all of these, there's always a problem. Theologians love to find something that seems to provide a perfect answer and then pick it apart to no end. So the problem is that what happens when people actually do not approach relationship building in such the same way, people who approach socializing in a way that is not, for lack of a better word, normal, right? And so in the case of how we stereotypically think about autistic people, that might be the case. And so what I wanted to do in the article was then to ask, here's a gap, right? We've found this better way of thinking about it in a relational sense, and yet I found a way it seems to not make sense. How do we approach that? And I suggested that actually it's a dialogue between autistic and not autistic people that isn't necessarily a literal talking to each other, but the more like philosophical use of the word of dialogue, in that it's the bringing together of not necessarily opposing, but just different ideas. I draw a lot from Paulo Freire's Pedagogy of the Oppressed, which, if any, talking about youth work, anyone on here is a youth worker. When you leave here, go and buy Pedagogy of the Oppressed. It's amazing. Okay, it's absolutely brilliant if you're doing work with young people, vulnerable people, whatever it is. He argues that a dialogue, in order to approach oppression and marginalized communities, cannot be displaced by like a hierarchical power dynamic. So usually what happens is there's someone in a position of power, person A, and that they set the terms for how this dialogue, how this conversation, how this mechanism is going to work. And then person B, the oppressed person, has to always look up to person A. And what that means, this is what Freire argues, is that that's not really necessarily a productive dialogue. And the only thing that's reinforcing is the oppression of the oppressed. What needs to happen is the oppressor, person A in this example, needs to recognize that they're in a position of oppression. And that's how these scales get balanced out. That's then where I suggest that maybe D&D is a way of doing that. Again, and I do make this clear, it's still not perfect. There is still like a power dynamic between like the DM and the player characters, but I think that there is a environment created where it is at least starting to become approachable, how we can balance the scales a bit more, that power dynamic, and how I can bring something to that group as an autistic person and actually listen to other people's experiences, even outside of the context of like things like disability, but faith as well. So not everyone in the group is a Christian. Some of us are vicars, some of us are theologians, some of us aren't Christian. That creates a really interesting conversation about faith. One of the themes that's coming out in our game at the moment is what happens when we're in a world where there used to be gods and now they're gone, and yet one person remembers them, and that one person happens to be a non-Christian in the real world. That's a really interesting, and that was their idea. They led that kind of storytelling. That is where I think there is real opportunity to bridge the gap in that relational aspect of the Imago Dei. So yeah, I hope that answers your question. That was a little bit rambly, but yeah, very interesting question. Thank you.
That's some really interesting points in your answer there, Harry. Thank you for that. Next question is a bit more straightforward, hopefully. How would you recommend getting started in D&D? Are there ways to learn the rules without playing in order to sit in the DM chair? You're going to have to tell me what the DM chair is to start with, Harry.
So the DM chair is just we could call that like putting yourself in the role of the DM, because usually the DM sits at the end of the table and is meant to be, they usually have like, this is again in the real world and not virtually, they usually have like a screen up so that they can do things in secret. And so they're often placed at the end. Again, this is interesting from that kind of power dynamic thing I was just talking about. I'm really glad this question was asked, because I kind of predicted inevitably someone would ask, and so I had already thought about it. In terms of learning the rules without playing the game, there is a series on YouTube, and they also do it as a podcast on Spotify, stuff like that, called Critical Role. It's really popular in the D&D crowd. It's for better or worse, because similarly to what I was talking about with the video we watched, their production value is insane, and it perhaps isn't entirely representative of the on the ground experience, but Critical Role is just a group of friends playing D&D, but they all happen to be voice actors, so you would probably recognize their voices for if you're into video games or whatever. You probably recognize a few of them, and they really bring their expertise as actors and actresses into playing the game. I think it's a really good way to introduce not just how of the playing the game, the rules, as it were, but it's just a good example of like what can be done, because those guys aren't afraid to kind of address the similar themes to what I've been chatting about today, and that has led to like genuine tears of like grief when a character dies. They're not real, it doesn't matter, and yet they feel real grief. I think that's really interesting, so I'd recommend that. Give it a look. It's worth saying that the episodes are very long. And so if you do not have the time for that, again, they do a podcast as well. Their game has also been adapted into an animated series on Amazon Prime, if you're interested. It's called like The Legend of Vox Machina. I think that's right. Give it a look. Again, that's not really going to teach you the rules though, but it's an interesting point. Secondly, the kind of base level rules, the starting out what you need to know, is available for free on the Dungeons and Dragons website, and they have a tool called D&D Beyond on their website that's like a virtual environment you can build characters in, and that just helps you kind of learn what the options are. It means you're less likely to make a mistake because it does all the calculations for you, that kind of thing. We don't use that because I love a good paper and pen, and I love being able to write down and roll a real dice. But it's there, and it's meant, the goal of it was meant to be accessibility. And that's kind of the theme for the current edition of the game. Is it was meant to, they knew that they had a very devoted fan base in that D&D was very nerdy, but also very isolated, as this is a thing you are in or you're out. The changes they made with 5th edition, the current one, in order to make it more open to interpretation, in order to put storytelling more centrally, although the options are obviously still there to just ignore that aspect of the game, means that it is the most approachable it's ever been. So that's what I'd recommend. There are also the company that publishes Dungeons and Dragons is called Wizards of the Coast. So Wizards of the Coast also publish kits with pre-made campaigns in, even down to characters that have already been written for you. So if you literally just want to learn the rules and get into it, it's there from the get-go. It's great to start out as a DM because all the kind of plot points that you have to plan in advance, they've been done for you. There's tons of examples of those, loads and loads of them. So give them a look. Thanks for your question.
Great. Super. Okay, a more personal one now. What would you say has been the most impactful roleplay moment in D&D, and how did it affect you in real life?
That's my favorite question so far, I think. I should have thought of this beforehand. There was a moment where I don't know how to say this without sounding so incredibly nerdy, but also do it without necessarily giving all the entire backstory. But basically, if I attempt to do this, Nine, the character I was talking about, was given a mission to deliver this magical sword he had discovered to a person, this mysterious person that lives in the woods. And so eventually, the adventure that the team go on eventually leads us to this mysterious woods, and we know that this is coming. And meanwhile, the way I've been playing Nine thus far is someone who is kind of maybe looking for purpose a little bit. He's been given this sword and told, "Here's your purpose. You must deliver this to my friend. I am a all-powerful, all-knowing God, and you must do this because I've told you to." And he's playing around with these ideas of, well, do I want to listen to this guy? He says he's a god, but what does that mean? Do I even care? That kind of thing. So as he gets to the woods, he discovers that the mysterious person, this is very convenient that I brought it up earlier, is actually my previous character. So Therin, the elf, who I talked about in the presentation, the person who was slightly more surface level and inspired by my job as a youth worker, right? Except he's kind of forgotten who he is. He's no longer this noble knight. And he's been corrupted by some dark magic or something like that. And so Nine's put in a position where he knows that this is the person he's meant to give the sword to, but he doesn't know if he trusts him. And so he tries to get Therin to prove that he can, but he can't. Therin's lost his way too much. He's gone to the dark side, perhaps, to nick a metaphor. And then Nine realizes that it isn't really his responsibility to necessarily fix Therin, but actually Therin must step forward and approach him. So instead of giving him the sword, he throws it onto the ground, and Therin has to come and approach him and pick it up. And when he picks it up, the magic of the sword heals him or whatever. And in that moment, I didn't really think much of it. I was like, Nine's a bit weirded out by this. He doesn't necessarily care a huge amount about the why, this has happened. He's just here now, and he sees someone who's clearly very conflicted, and it doesn't match the amazing picture he was given by this god who said that this was this amazing, awesome, powerful person. It doesn't match the expectation he had. And in talking about it afterwards, this friend of mine, the DM who was running the game, said that he did not expect me to respond to it in that way. What he expected me to respond with is, "Oh, look, it's Theron. It's my guy. I love him. He's great. I made that character. I want to save him." And instead, Nine actually asks Theron to step forward. He throws the sword on the ground, and it's up to him to take on that role and to kind of become that noble warrior again. And it had a profound impact on like how the other players then interacted with Nine as someone who was kind of like a bit lost at this point, and then suddenly realized that he can choose his own destiny almost. That was really cool. And that was a bit of like a breakthrough moment with me realizing what I wanted to do with the character as well. And that led to a whole storyline where Nine, kind of inspired by that moment, realizes that actually he can step forward too. He has that agency, he has that ability, and it doesn't really matter what other people think of him. What's up with Nine? Nine's just Nine, that kind of thing. But actually he can choose. So yeah, thank you for that question. It was a great question. Loved it.
That was a great question. That was a great answer too. Thank you, Harry, for sharing something, and especially when these things are very personal.
Yeah.
And the next question, I'm just going to summarize this one because it's quite long, but also thanks you for sharing such a personal and fragile story. So this is an adult with an autism diagnosis who also teaches in a school with autistic young people in his or her class, and asks for your perspective on using D&D in the classroom, specifically for someone who's a teacher of religion, a religious studies teacher. So any thoughts on how that might work out in practice?
Yes. So very conveniently, I have a very specific example I can give. So in a similar context to the youth group where we played D&D, we took that same story, as it were, to a what's the word? Like a not boarding school, but it was like a residential unit that was part of a school. So it was local to us. It was an all boys school, and there was a lot of additional needs, a whole range of additional needs, and so a lot of the young people were autistic as well. And our job was to work with the lads who, there was about 5 or 6 of them, I think, who were in this residential unit. And we realized that they needed, well, not necessarily that they needed, but something that they weren't getting at that point was something that brought all of them together. So they were pleasant to one another, but they didn't feel like a group. And we wondered if there was something that could really benefit the relationships that they had together, given that they lived with one another. They not only lived with one another, but then they went to school with they couldn't remove themselves from one another. We should probably look into whether there is a way that we can bring these boys together. And so we used D&D. And it was another level stripped back from the youth group. So if I remember right, characters were built for them, so there was absolutely no planning needed necessary, and we had kind of set out beforehand, weeks in advance, exactly how this would look and what was expected and what wasn't expected at all. And to just reiterate that this is still a game, and the point is to have fun, and if it stops being fun, then there's no point in doing this. Okay. And they loved it. It was great. They took it in a completely different direction to the people in the youth group. And And even though I think there was a little bit of anxiety in a few of them, even though they knew the theory in like putting themselves out there and being like, I don't know what to do now. What do I do? Give me options. Because it was this kind of simplified version of it, we were able to kind of lay out, okay, well, here's 3 things you could do. What do you want to do? Here's 3. That's a lot more approachable than the how do you want to do this of traditional flavored D&D. I think that's maybe an easier way to approach it, especially when coming from the perspective of working with autistic kids as well. In the context that we were in, a lot of the boys who were in the residential unit weren't there willingly either. And so there was some kind of like emotional things they were still carrying that we had to be conscious of. And that likely influenced why they were less willing to build relationships with one another. Ultimately, what it came down to was a bunch of teenage boys got to have a great laugh and eat pizza and have fun who might not have done otherwise. And I hope that it just like planted this seed in their brain of like, actually, I can do this, given the right support and given it a pace that I can do. This kind of thing isn't impossible for me. And I think as an autistic person, that's the default so often. And yet this game has like enabled a different perspective on that. And so in order to take it into schools, I think especially because you're almost already working on a back foot in that the environment you're in might not be an environment that the young people are willing to have that level of introspection. Maybe they don't like school, and that's going to be difficult to remove that context from the having fun of the game. But I by no means think it's impossible at all. I think I would have loved to have some sort of D&D club when I was at school. I didn't really like address it hugely in the presentation, but I did really struggle when I got to like doing my GCSE exams, and a lot of that spouted from just not having a real place I could call home, and I kind of forced that to then be church. And that's why I'm a theologian. And I just embed myself in learning about religion and church and Christianity and stuff like that, which was still good. But something that was definitely lacking from my school experience was forming relationships where I genuinely felt like at all moments I could be honest with the person I'm talking to. It's not like I didn't have friends at school. I had friends, but there were definitely times where I needed to have a chat, and I just wasn't ready yet to chat to them. Maybe if I had something like D&D, maybe if I played D&D with that group of friends that I had at school, maybe that relationship would have been built up. And then again, you have to then contend with teenage boys, and teenage boys, speaking from experience, can be challenging. I hope that answers your question.
Great, thank you, Harry. Well, let's stay with teenage boys and emotions. The next questioner asks, you mentioned on the YouTube show that people have been brought to tears. Have you or anyone you've played with ever been affected emotionally in such a way, good or bad? And is this a good thing?
So that's really interesting. Is it a good thing? So yeah, really interesting question. Very conveniently, when I was writing the article that I spoke about, I was on a train from here in Aberdeen down to Stafford because I was going to spend the weekend at my mate's house because it was his 30th birthday. And rather than having a big old booze up or whatever, as most people I would assume want to do, he wanted to play Dungeons and Dragons with his friends because we're all big nerds. So this friend whose birthday it was, he's the DM who runs our games. And like I said, we usually play online because we're so spread out. I'm up in northeast Scotland and they're all down south, across the border. And so this was going to be the first time in ages we had played in person. And it was also very conveniently, although this wasn't really the plan, it just played out like this, that it was going to act as like a season finale where we would beat the bad guy, for lack of a better words, and we would say goodbye to the characters we're playing. And then we would take a little break and come back in a few months' time, 1,000 years on, in a new world. So, something happened at the end that changed everything. And so we're going to jump ahead a huge amount of time and see what the world looks like. That was really interesting. That last session where we were in person became so eye-opening to me in how far I'd come in building relationships with these guys, who some of which I had actually never met in person until that moment. There were 2 people in the group who I'd only met because they were invited to play D&D with us, and who I'd not actually seen. I think no, so there was one guy I'd met. The other one, there was one guy I'd literally never actually seen in the flesh. It had always been on a screen, and yet somehow I knew him really well from playing a game where we pretend to be other people. That's really weird. And so when it came to we were all given the DM gave us all he called it a Marvel end credit scene. You know how in Marvel films, in loads of films now, there's a bit at the end. If you stay behind and sit through all the names, there's a thing that happens at the end, a little secret 10-second clip. And so we're all given those moments, and those were all used as goodbyes. And it was weirdly sad. These people don't exist. I'm not saying goodbye to anyone. In a couple months' time, I'm going to be sat in front of my computer screen playing D&D again. And yet there was this emotional tie that I had welded myself, not just to 9, but the other guys as well, through the stories we wanted to tell, through the characters we wanted to play as. That meant there was a real weight to saying goodbye. To answer the second part of your question, I think it absolutely can be a good thing. There is an obvious risk to it, though. I think, like I said, I've been incredibly lucky to find a group who love me and who support me, and who pray for me, and who are really keen to know how I'm doing with my studies and how my kids are doing, all that kind of stuff. It's not just a relationship built around playing a game in that sense. And so when we have those moments where, like in the example, you're brought to tears because of grief for someone who doesn't exist, it's a safe environment to do that. I think had I not had that kind of level of support, it would be very difficult to do it appropriately. And I think that is exemplified by the example I gave where another player wanted to explore depression. And there was this moment where we all had to ask ourselves, are we okay with this? And we could be honest with our friend and say, do you mind toning that down? But actually, it was done in a way that I think was safe in the end, where even though we were pushing boundaries and it was prickly and challenging and stuff like that, it ultimately did lead to a happy ending and to a point where the player could address a really difficult part of his real lived experience. Had he not had that, I think it would have it would have been difficult to do it in a way where not only is the player kind of protected, but the other players are as well, because you don't necessarily know exactly what other people have gone through. And there was a distinct moment where we had to say, do we tone this down because we're not sure everyone's quite ready for that kind of stuff? But because we were able to have that conversation, we were able to come to a better conclusion. So yeah, in short, I think it is a good thing. Apply with caution, effectively. Thank you for your question. Really interesting.
Brilliant. Thanks so much, Harry. And I think what you've said there has really addressed the one outstanding question that we've not had time to get to today. But unfortunately, it is time for us to wrap up. We've used our time well today. Thank you so much, Harry, for such an interesting topic for discussion. I'm sure people will continue to reach out to you through the centre with more questions and thoughts on this.
Absolutely.
So just a note to our participants to feel free to do that. Thank you to everyone who's joined us live today and to those of you watching back later on YouTube. If you enjoyed this webinar, do take a look at the Centre for Autism and Theology website, where you can find out what's coming up in our programme of events, and you can join our mailing list there to be sure that you don't miss anything. But for now, goodbye from us, and thank you to everyone who's joined us today.